Hi, I'm Salome, and I'm a Level 1 student at the Global Forecasting School. The Better Policy Project was founded by Douglas Laxton after he retired from the IMF, and its goal is to help make economic policy more effective, not only by developing better analytical frameworks, but also by making those frameworks understandable and useful to policymakers and the public. We also develop, model, and teach state-of-the-art approaches to monetary, fiscal, and macroprudential policy. Our work focuses on three closely connected areas: raising economic and financial literacy, improving the analytical frameworks used in policymaking, and improving the way policy is communicated to the public. If you're interested in our work, please like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and leave us a comment. We'd really like to hear your thoughts and feedback. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and visit our websites to learn more about the Better Policy Project and the Global Forecasting School. You'll find all the links in the description below. And since Doug is the person who started all of this, I should probably introduce him properly. We have a very warm and relaxed working environment at the Better Policy Project. Although, judging by this picture, I'm not sure everyone will believe me. I promise it's much friendlier than it looks. But jokes aside, since today's paper builds on ideas Doug has worked on throughout his career, it's worth giving you a little context about his work. A few years after Doug retired from the IMF, an interesting paper came out that gives us a different perspective on his time there. The paper is called Network Effects and Research Collaborations, written by Dennis Essers, Francesco Grigoli, and Evgenia Pugacheva, and published as an IMF working paper in 2020. The authors look at almost 3 decades of IMF working papers, from 1990 to 2017, and map the network of research collaboration, essentially, who was writing with whom and how those researchers were connected. And when they look at the core of that network, Doug is pretty hard to miss. He appears alongside highly connected researchers such as Tam Bayumi, Davide Furseri, Michael Kumhoff, Stein Claessens, Prakash Lungani, and Era Dabla Norris. The larger the node, the more papers that researcher contributed to, while the connections show collaboration between authors. So Doug's position gives you a sense of both the scale of his research and how connected his work was across the IMF research community. And that gives us some useful context for the work we're discussing today. A recurring question in Doug's work has been, how do policymakers make good decisions when the future is uncertain? One answer is to think in scenarios, rather than pretending we know exactly what the future will look like. And that brings us directly to the paper we're looking at today. And this is a particularly timely moment for this conversation. This week, attention is turning to Kevin Warsh and the Federal Reserve at Jackson Hole. Markets will be listening closely to what the Fed says about monetary policy, but also to how it communicates its outlook and strategy. And that's where our paper, Beyond the Dot Plot, becomes especially relevant. It asks a simple question. Could the Fed communicate uncertainty more clearly by moving beyond individual interest rate dots and using scenarios instead? The paper explores this through 11 questions, looking at the dot plot, forward guidance, and how policy could respond as economic conditions change. But they all come back to one big question. What should replace the dot plot? So, let's look at the key difference between dots and scenarios. The dot plot shows where individual policymakers think interest rates might go, but a dot is ultimately just a number. It doesn't tell us the full story behind it, what policymakers assume about inflation or growth, which risks they're worried about, or what might cause their view to change. And that's where scenarios can help. Instead of asking only, where will interest rates be, scenarios ask, how would policy respond if economic conditions changed? We start with a market reference scenario, our central case, and then consider alternatives. Case A could represent stronger demand or more persistent inflation, leading to higher interest rates. Case B could represent weaker growth or faster disinflation, leading to lower rates. So the difference is simple. The dot plot shows where policymakers think rates might go. Scenarios help explain why and what could make policy change. And for me, that's what makes this paper interesting. It's not about predicting exactly where interest rates will go. It's about being more honest about uncertainty. A central forecast asks, what do we think will happen? But scenarios make us ask something just as important. What if we're wrong? The economy changes, unexpected shocks happen, and policy has to respond. So instead of relying on one view of the future, scenarios help us think about what could happen and how policy should respond. And that's the basic idea behind Beyond the Dot Plot. But we've only scratched the surface. The discussion that follows takes a deeper look at the paper's 11 questions and what scenario-based guidance could mean for the future of Fed communication. As you listen, let us know what you think. If you agree, disagree, or have a question, leave us a comment below. And stay tuned. On September 10th at 2 p.m. London time, the Better Policy Project will record a special panel discussion featuring Chris Giles of the Financial Times alongside other policymakers and economists. We'll publish the recording the following day, so don't miss it, and leave any questions you'd like us to discuss in the comments. For now, let's dive into the podcast.
Imagine you're on a road trip, right? You punch your destination into the GPS, and instead of showing you the actual route, the screen just shows a single blinking dot at your destination.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No roads, no traffic updates, no alternate routes if a bridge is out. Just here is where you will end up.
Right.
You'll probably panic the second you hit a detour.
Oh, absolutely. Because knowing the destination is, it's practically useless if you don't actually understand the geography between here and there. I mean, if the map goes blank the moment a storm hits, you're just driving blind.
Exactly. So let's unpack this today. Because for years, everyone from Wall Street traders to Main Street business owners has obsessed over the Federal Reserve's version of that blinking dot.
The famous dot plot.
The dot plot, right. And we're sitting here in August 2026, and there's just a massive rebellion brewing over how the Fed communicates.
Right.
It really kicked into overdrive recently when Fed Chair Kevin Warsh, he point blank declined to submit his personal projections during a press conference.
Yeah, that was wild.
He basically stood up and said the framework we've been relying on is structurally flawed.
Which was a shocking moment of candor. But it perfectly sets the stage for the grounding source of our deep dive today. We're looking at a highly influential working paper. It's titled Beyond the Dot Plot, Towards Scenario-Based Monetary Policy.
Right.
And it fundamentally argues that central bank transparency shouldn't just be about, dumping more raw data on the public. It's really about reducing avoidable uncertainty regarding how policymakers actually think.
And that is our mission today. We are going to rip this framework apart and look at the 11 pivotal questions this paper raises, just to understand why the dot plot is broken and how shifting to a new blueprint, something they call scenario-based conventional forward guidance, could kind of revolutionize the way the entire global economy operates.
Yeah, to really appreciate the revolution, we first have to understand the flaw in the current system. So the dot plot, for anyone who doesn't refresh the Fed's website religiously, it's part of the Summary of Economic Projections.
The SEP.
Right, the SESI. So 4 times a year, every Fed official drops a literal dot on a chart, and that represents where they think the federal funds interest rate should be in the coming years.
But those dots are completely anonymous.
Yes.
And more importantly, they are totally disconnected from any sort of economic narrative. I mean, I look at a dot sitting at 5%, and I have absolutely no idea why that specific policymaker put it there.
And that right there is the core limitation the paper identifies in its early questions: false precision. Financial markets have this incredibly bad habit of looking at that scatter plot of dots, calculating the mathematical middle, and then fixating on the median dot.
Yeah.
They treat that median as the official intended path for interest rates. But that median might just be a Frankenstein monster that combines completely contradictory economic views.
It sounds like a group text trying to pick a restaurant. Everyone drops an anonymous pin on a map of the city. You average out all the coordinates, and the median pin lands right in the middle of a lake.
That's a great way to put it.
No individual actually wants to eat in the lake, but that's what the math says the group wants.
Exactly. That analogy gets right to the heart of it. You could have 2 different Fed officials look at the economy and choose the exact same interest rate, but for totally opposite reasons.
Okay, how so?
Well, policymaker A might think, inflation is going to be incredibly sticky, so we need higher rates to cool prices down. But policymaker B might look at the exact same data and think, well, inflation is totally fine, but the stock market is in a dangerous bubble, so we need higher rates to pop the exuberance.
So they both vote for 5%, but their roadmaps are completely different. The dot plot records the numerical agreement, but it completely deletes the economic reasoning behind it?
And that creates a massive problem because internally, a central banker views their dot as a highly flexible judgment. It's based on today's weather forecast. If the weather changes, the dot moves.
Right.
But externally, markets look at that dot and they treat it like a blood oath. They build multi-billion-dollar portfolios around it.
So if the dot plot is giving markets this Frankenstein median that no one actually believes, what on earth is the alternative? Because we've seen the Fed try different communication strategies over the past 2 decades, and they almost always seem to end in a market panic.
Well, think about what markets actually need to understand. That's a big focus of the paper's third and fourth questions. Markets don't need a central bank to pretend it has a crystal ball. They need a conditional strategy.
Okay.
They need to understand the central bank's reaction function, meaning if X happens to the economy, we will do Y.
That makes sense in theory, but in practice, didn't the Fed try giving forward guidance after the 2008 financial crisis? They made all sorts of promises about keeping rates low, and it eventually just backed them into a corner.
They did. But the paper draws a vital distinction between two types of forward guidance, Delphic and Odyssean. And the Fed fell into the trap of Odyssean guidance.
Okay, we're pulling out the Greek mythology here. So Delphic, like the Oracle of Delphi, predicting the future. And Odyssean, like Odysseus, tying himself to the mast of his ship to resist the sirens.
Exactly. So let's apply that to monetary policy. Delphic guidance is a conditional forecast. It basically says, based on our current view of the economy, we think rates will go here, but we are not tied to the mast.
Right, if the economy changes, our path will change.
Yes. Odyssean guidance, on the other hand, is a rigid commitment. It is tying yourself to the mast, trying to force the market to behave by promising a certain action, regardless of how conditions might shift down the line.
Like saying, we promise to keep interest rates at 0 until the year 2024.
Yes. That is a calendar-based Odyssean promise, and while it feels incredibly reassuring to a business owner in the short term that false certainty is really dangerous, the Fed's guidance evolved from qualitative words like keeping rates low for an extended period, to specific calendar dates, to numerical thresholds.
Wow.
And each step toward greater numerical precision just created a heavier anchor.
Because what happens if you promise 0% through 2024, but suddenly in 2022, inflation just goes absolutely nuclear? You are tied to the mast of a sinking ship.
And we saw this play out in reality. During the 2013 taper tantrum and the massive 2021 to 2022 tightening cycle, the Fed had painted itself into a corner. When economic conditions changed dramatically and the Fed finally had to abandon that expected path to fight inflation, the market felt betrayed.
Yeah, they treat it like a broken promise rather than a logical reaction to new data.
Exactly. The market had focused so heavily on the expected tool, the interest rate, that they completely ignored the actual economy that tool was supposed to be managing.
So how do we fix this? Because this isn't just theory. The paper actually looks at global central banks that have already successfully moved past these rigid Odyssean promises, right?
They have. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has been championing something called the Forecasting and Policy Analysis System. We can just call it FPAS.
Okay, FPAS.
Yeah. If you look at seasoned inflation-targeting central banks in places like the Czech Republic and Sweden, they don't publish a scattershot of anonymous dots. They publish comprehensive conditional interest rate paths.
Meaning they actually show the math.
They show the whole roadmap. The entire projected path of the interest rate is explicitly linked to their projections for inflation and unemployment. It's a fully integrated model.
Bringing back our road trip analogy, it's exactly like a modern GPS app. If there's a massive pileup on the highway, the GPS recalculates your route onto back roads. You don't get furious at the GPS for breaking its promise to take the highway.
No.
You're just relieved it's reacting to the real-time data and keeping you moving toward your destination.
That is the essence of forecast targeting. The credibility of a central bank shouldn't be based on whether their 2-year-old forecast was perfectly accurate. Credibility comes from the consistency of their process.
Right.
The paper points to Chile and Armenia, specifically Armenia's prudent risk management approach. They've proven that if you change your projected rate path based on new data and you explain why, it actually enhances your credibility. It proves to the market that you are awake at the wheel.
And there's a fascinating detail in the paper about small open economies like those. It points out that transparency is even more crucial for them because they face something called fear of floating.
That's a critical concept. In a small, open economy, if the currency suddenly depreciates, meaning the exchange rate tanks, it can cause catastrophic inflation and destroy corporate balance sheets literally overnight. So these central banks often have to intervene to support their currency.
But if they're supposed to just be targeting domestic inflation, intervening in the currency markets looks like they're breaking their own rules.
Exactly the risk. If their communication is opaque, markets assume the central bank has lost the plot. Panic sets in, expectations become unanchored, and foreign capital flees the country. But if that central bank uses a highly transparent, scenario-based framework, if they clearly explain, hey, we are intervening in the currency because it impacts our inflation target through these specific channels, they maintain their credibility.
Wow.
The lesson here is profound. You survive uncertainty through transparent, state-contingent strategy, not by hiding behind anonymous dots.
Okay, so if the dot plot is officially dead, how does the U.S. Federal Reserve specifically apply these global lessons? Because Wall Street isn't just going to accept, we'll see how it goes, as a policy. The paper proposes replacing the dots with 3 very specific, very cohesive pillars. Let's walk through those.
Right, so the proposed framework is called Scenario-Based Conventional Forward Guidance. Pillar 1 is the market reference scenario. This is a baseline path that reflects current market pricing and professional forecasts. It is not an official Fed promise, it just establishes a common reality. It says, here is what the market currently assumes is going to happen.
It's the starting line. It grounds the conversation in reality before we start playing what if.
Exactly. And taking that a step further, the real magic happens in pillars 2 and 3. The Fed would build internally consistent alternatives around that baseline. So you introduce case A, an alternative scenario requiring a higher interest rate path. The Fed would detail a specific narrative, maybe inflation proves stickier than expected, or consumer demand suddenly surges.
And then naturally, you have case B, an alternative requiring a lower rate path. Say a negative demand shock hits, or there's a massive boom in AI productivity that drives prices down naturally, so you just don't need rates as high.
You've got it. 3 distinct logical narratives.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, though. I know Wall Street. The quantitative analysts love exact numbers. They build trading algorithms based on decimal points. So if the Fed publishes case A and case B, aren't the quants going to demand exact probabilities? Are we going to see a Fed report saying, we assign a 32.5% probability to case A and a 14% probability to case B?
The paper is incredibly strict on this point. Absolutely no exact probabilities. If you start assigning mechanical percentages to these scenarios, you are just inventing a new form of false precision.
Because you can't mathematically calculate the exact odds of a geopolitical shock or a sudden pandemic or a supply chain collapse.
You can't. And pretending you can is dangerous. The goal of these scenarios isn't to play gambling odds or give algorithms a number to scrape. The goal is to illustrate the policy response. It forces the public to understand the actual economic mechanisms the Fed is watching.
Right.
Alan Greenspan actually famously championed this risk management approach. You don't just plan for the sunny day baseline, you formally plan for the tail risks.
To ground this in reality, let's look at the Fed's massive inflation miss in 2021. The paper uses this as the ultimate cautionary tale. How would having a case A and case B have prevented them from calling inflation transitory for a year while prices skyrocketed?
It really comes down to the data they were prioritizing. In 2021, policymakers relied heavily on slow, backward-looking year-over-year inflation data. Now think about the math of a year-over-year average. It smooths out 12 months of data.
So if you have 10 months of basically zero inflation and then 2 months of prices skyrocketing, that 12-month average still looks pretty tame because it's being dragged down by the 10 flat months. It's sluggish.
But if you looked at the 3-month annualized data, which only looks at the recent trend and projects it forward, it was screaming that inflation was spiking dangerously. It was noisy, but it was accurate. The paper argues that if a scenario-based system had been in place, the Fed would have been forced to game out a persistent inflation risk, a case A, well in advance.
They would have had to publicly define what evidence would trigger case A. They might have said, if we see 3-month annualized data spike past a certain threshold, we abandon the baseline and aggressively raise rates.
Yes.
But instead, they clung to the transitory narrative because they hadn't formally organized the alternative scenarios. They were just winging it.
And that leads to the most fascinating twist in this entire paper. The Federal Reserve actually possesses one of the most sophisticated forecasting infrastructures on the planet. Behind closed doors, they already do this.
Wait, you're saying they already had these scenarios?
Internally, yes. The Fed staff uses this exact methodology to produce something called the Teal Book. It is a highly confidential document prepared for policymakers before every meeting. The staff runs brilliant, model-consistent alternative scenarios showing exactly how different economic shocks would require different interest rate paths.
So they have the GPS map, they have the alternate routes, they evaluate these beautifully coherent narratives internally, but externally, they walk out of the meeting and hand the public a scatter plot of disconnected dots.
Pretty much.
That is maddening. I mean, if they already have the Teal Book, why the secrecy? We live in a democracy. If the central bank has data on how a recession might play out, doesn't the public have a right to see that full Teal Book immediately so markets can price it in?
It's a delicate balance, and total transparency can actually be destructive. The paper addresses this by citing a famous legal precedent, FOMC v. Merrill. If every single internal debate, preliminary staff judgment, and worst-case scenario simulation is made public immediately, you destroy candid deliberation.
How so?
Imagine a Fed staffer wants to run a model on a total collapse of the commercial real estate market, just as a stress test, just to see what policy tools they would need. If that draft report leaks or is published in real time, the market sees it, panics, and actually causes the commercial real estate collapse.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, policymakers would be terrified to explore controversial or low-probability doomsday scenarios for fear of triggering the exact crisis they are trying to prevent.
Okay, I see the trap. So how do we get the benefit of the Teal Book without accidentally blowing up the economy?
The paper solution is elegant. You don't publish the Teal Book. Leave the staff's sandbox private. Instead, you create a separately prepared, committee-owned public document. And you limit the public release to just those three cohesive narratives we talked about. The market reference, case A, and case B.
Keep it to 3. That avoids information overload, but it still organizes their internal disagreement into coherent public contingencies. It shares the strategic logic without spilling every messy internal debate.
And this brings us to the real-world impact, specifically regarding financial stability. Because bad communication doesn't just confuse people, it actually breaks the banking system. The paper leans into the debt trap concept, something economists like William White have warned about for years.
The debt trap. How does forward guidance create a trap?
When a central bank relies on Odyssean guidance, when they unconditionally promise to keep interest rates near zero for years into the future, they compress risk premiums. Markets start to believe the Fed has effectively eliminated interest rate risk.
And when risk goes down, greed goes up. People borrow a ton of money.
They leverage up massively. And we have to unpack how this works mechanically through what's called endogenous money creation. When a bank makes a loan, it doesn't just hand over a pile of cash from a vault. The bank literally creates a matching deposit in the borrower's account out of thin air.
Right. The loan creates the deposit.
Exactly. Credit expands rapidly, so the entire financial system starts organizing its balance sheets around this single, officially promised low-rate path, completely ignoring alternative economic contingencies.
The balloon just keeps inflating.
Yeah.
And the paper specifically cites the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank as the prime example of this blowing up. Let's walk through that because it perfectly illustrates the danger of the dot plot.
SVB didn't fail because they made bad loans to risky startups. They failed because they believed the Fed's dot plot.
That's the tragic irony. Look at a risk manager at SVB in 2021. They are flooded with deposits. They look at the Fed's forward guidance, which seems to promise that rates will stay low for the foreseeable future. So they take billions of dollars and invest them in long-term U.S. Treasury bonds.
Which are supposed to be the safest asset on Earth.
Safest from default risk, yes, but highly vulnerable to interest rate risk. When inflation forced the Fed to panic and hike rates rapidly from roughly 0 to over 5%, the value of those long-term low-yield bonds plummeted.
Yeah, SVB was sitting on massive unrealized losses. When depositors got spooked and tried to pull their money out, SVB had to sell those bonds at a catastrophic loss, and the bank collapsed.
But if scenario-based conventional forward guidance had been in place, that whole timeline changes.
Entirely. If the Fed had been publishing a cases scenario all along, explicitly stating, hey, if inflation gets sticky, we will have to hike rates to 5%, well, bank supervisors and risk managers would have been forced to stress test their portfolios against that exact narrative. You prevent the financial system from betting the house on a single sunny day baseline.
So what does this all mean for the everyday listener? We've talked about global central banks, Teal books, and banking collapses. What is the definitive prescription here? What actually replaces the dot plot?
The prescription is clean and precise. You keep the summary of economic projections. The SP still contains great, high-level macroeconomic info on GDP, inflation, and unemployment, but you scrap the anonymous policy rate dots entirely.
Just erase them. Erase them from the chart. Replace them with a quarterly publication of the 3 linked scenarios: the market reference, case A, and case B.
It changes the entire conversation. Instead of Wall Street obsessing over, where exactly will rates be in 2 years, the market is forced to ask, how will the Fed pursue its mandate if the economy shifts? The market has to do its own homework. It has to watch the incoming data and decide for itself if we are heading toward case A or case B, rather than blindly trusting a median dot that lands in the middle of a lake.
It restores the market's role in independent price discovery while making the central bank's actual strategy radically more transparent. It acknowledges that uncertainty exists and offers a rational framework for navigating it.
It really is a massive leap forward. Okay, let's wrap this up. We've gone from the disjointed group text chaos of the dot plot to a cohesive GPS-like scenario system. It's about moving from false promises to conditional strategies, learning from the global pioneers in inflation targeting, and protecting financial stability by forcing markets to actually acknowledge risk. It's a shift from predicting the future to preparing for it. And that makes all the difference.
I love it. But before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on this, but pushes it a bit further. If the Federal Reserve successfully shifts to this scenario-based, narrative-rich guidance, how will AI-driven trading algorithms handle it? I mean, think about it. Right now, algorithmic trading relies on scraping numerical dots in milliseconds to execute high-frequency trades. But if the guidance is suddenly based on nuanced, conditional economic narratives and structural mechanisms, could this actually neutralize algorithmic flash trading? Could replacing a single false number with a complex narrative force a return to human fundamental analysis on Wall Street? It's something to think about.
That is a fascinating question. The algorithms would have to learn how to read a story, not just a spreadsheet.
We'll leave you with that. The GPS is recalculated. Thanks for diving deep with us.